Well, I appreciate very much the personal testimony, Bill. I do think, though, that what we've seen is that Bill is at heart an evangelist who wants people to come to share his belief in Jesus, and that he's trying to disguise himself as a historian as a means to that end. I appreciate that, but it's not just whether a professional historian can argue something, it's whether history can be used to demonstrate claims about God. I have, in fact, disputed the 4 facts that he continually refers to. The burial by Joseph of Arimathea, I've argued, could well be a later invention. The empty tomb also could be a later invention. You don't have a reference to it in Paul. You only have it later in the Gospels. The appearances of Jesus may just as well have been visions of Jesus as they were physical appearances of Jesus, because people did and do have visions all the time. And an earlier point that Bill made, that the disciples were all willing to die for their faith. I didn't hear one piece of evidence for that. I hear that claim a lot, but having read every Christian source from the first 500 years of Christianity, I'd like him to tell us what the piece of evidence is that the disciples died for their belief in the resurrection. Bill went on to talk about why, in fact, my scenario doesn't work. He says it's more implausible that the family members stole the body than it would be to say that God raised Jesus from the dead. Why? They'd have no motive. Well, in fact, people act for all sorts of motives, and motive is one of the most difficult things to establish historically. Maybe his family wanted him to be buried in the family tomb. No one knew where he was buried, he says. Well, that's not true. In fact, the Gospels themselves says the women watched from afar, including his mother. There wasn't enough time for this to happen. It happened that night. How much time does one need? It doesn't explain the grave clothes. Well, the grave clothes are probably a later legendary embellishment. It can't explain the appearances of Jesus. Yes, people have visions all the time. Once people come to believe Jesus' tomb was empty, they come to believe he's raised from the dead, and they have visions. I'm not saying I think this happened. I think that it's plausible. It could have happened. It's more plausible than the claim that God must have raised Jesus from the dead. That is not the most possible, probable historical explanation. You will have noticed that Bill had 5 more minutes to answer my questions, and he's refused to answer my questions, and one might ask why. Let me conclude by telling you what I really do think about Jesus' resurrection. The one thing we know about the Christians after the death of Jesus is that they turned to their scriptures to try and make sense of it. They had believed Jesus was the Messiah, but then he got crucified, and so he couldn't be the Messiah. No Christian, no Jew prior to Christianity thought that the Messiah was to be crucified. No Jew prior to Christianity thought that the Messiah was to be crucified. The Messiah was to be a great warrior, or a great king, or a great judge. He's to be a figure of grandeur and power, not somebody who's squashed by the enemy like a mosquito. How could Jesus, the Messiah, have been killed as a common criminal? Christians turned to their scriptures to try and understand it, and they found passages that refer to the righteous one of God suffering death. But in these passages, such as Isaiah 53, and Psalm 22, and Psalm 69, the one who is punished or who is killed is also vindicated by God. Christians came to believe their scriptures that Jesus was the righteous one and that God must have vindicated him. And so Christians came to think of Jesus as one who, even though he had been crucified, came to be exalted to heaven, much as Elijah and Enoch had in the Hebrew scriptures. How then is Jesus the Messiah, though, if he's been exalted to heaven? Well, Jesus must be coming back soon to establish the kingdom. He wasn't an earthly Messiah, he's a spiritual Messiah. That's why the early Christians thought the end was coming right away in their own lifetime. That's why Paul taught that Christ was the first fruit of the resurrection. But if Jesus is exalted, he's no longer dead. And so Christians started circulating the story of his resurrection. It wasn't 3 days later they started circulating that story. It might have been a year later, maybe 2 years. 5 years later, they didn't know when the stories had started. Nobody could go to the tomb to check. The body had decomposed. Believers who knew that he'd been raised from the dead started having visions of him. Others told stories about these visions of him, including Paul. Stories of these visions circulated. Some of them were actual visions like Paul. Others of them were stories of visions like the 500 who repeatedly saw him. On the basis of these stories, narratives were constructed and circulated, and eventually we got the Gospels of the New Testament written 30, 40, 50, 60 years later.